Don't be a hero, you idiot. You'll get yourself killed and be no use to anyone. The captain's voice cut through the chaos like a rusted blade, loud enough for the entire crew to hear. His words echoed across the deck of the Sea Wolf, freezing the other men in their tracks. Their eyes, once wide with fear of the rocks we were drifting towards, were now fixed on me, judging me. The thick Kodiak fog swirled around us, tasting of salt and my own failure as our hull scraped helplessly against the unseen reef below. He was Silas, a man forged by these icy waters, and I was just an outsider playing at being a seaman. He saw me as a liability, not a diver. But as the tide pulled us closer to the jagged shore, I knew I was the only one who could save us. But nobody imagined what I would do that day. If this sentence reminded you of someone, just comment with, "I understand." My name is Alex. I'm 36 years old, though most days out here on the water, I feel 100. Before this, my hands knew the smooth, cool plastic of a keyboard, the precise click of a mouse. Now they're a geography of calluses, saltwater cracks, and rope burns, a constant aching reminder that I don't belong. I traded a life of predictable code in the lower 48 for the unpredictable chaos of the Bering Sea, thinking I was chasing something real. But in Kodiak, real has a very specific definition, and I'm not it. To men like Silas, the captain of the Sea Wolf, I'm just a tourist with a diver's certification. He sees my lack of a weathered face, my comparatively soft hands, and my quiet nature not as traits, but as weaknesses. He sees an outsider who thinks a piece of paper qualifies him to understand the language of these waters, a language Silas has been speaking since he was a boy. The humiliation wasn't a single event. It was the very air I breathed on that boat. It was 1,000 small cuts. I remember one morning, just after dawn, the docks were slick with frost and the air smelled of diesel and brine. We were taking on supplies, and Silas, in front of the entire crew and half the fishermen from the other boats, tossed me a length of thick, stiff mooring line. "Tie me a bowline, tech boy," he'd barked, his voice carrying across the water. "Let's see if all those books you read taught you anything useful." All eyes turned to me. I knew the nod, of course. I'd practiced it until my fingers bled. But under the weight of their collective gaze, my hands turned into clumsy, useless things. The rope felt alien. A few of the younger deckhands snickered. Silas just stood there, arms crossed, a cruel little smile playing on his lips. I finally got it tied, but it was sloppy and my face burned with a shame so hot it felt like it could melt the Alaskan frost. He just grunted, undid my pathetic attempt with a single contemptuous flick of his wrist, and retied it perfectly in under 3 seconds. He never said another word about it, but he didn't have to. The message was clear. You are not one of us. You are less. Another time we were caught in a squall, nothing too serious for these guys, but the waves were high enough to make my stomach churn. We were in the galley, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and fried fish. The men were swapping stories of the great storm of '09, their voices a low, comfortable rumble against the groaning of the ship's hull. I made the mistake of trying to join in, mentioning a documentary I'd seen about rogue waves. The conversation stopped dead. Silas, who was stirring a pot of stew, didn't even look at me. He just said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Some of us live it, Alex. Others just watch it on TV." The silence that followed was heavier than any wave. I felt like a ghost at their table, a complete and utter fraud. I took my plate and went out on the deck, letting the icy spray wash over me, preferring the honest violence of the sea to the quiet, suffocating contempt of the men inside. That was my life, a constant, grinding effort to prove I was worthy, met with a wall of derision that told me I never would be. The day everything changed started like any other. A thick, suffocating fog had rolled in, swallowing the islands and turning the world into a shifting canvas of gray on gray. The sea was unnervingly calm, the water like polished slate. We were navigating a notoriously tricky channel, one lined with submerged, boat-gutting rocks. The mood on the Sea Wolf was tense, but it was a familiar tension, the kind these men lived with. But as I was checking my dive gear, I started to notice something else. A sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible beneath the steady thrum of the diesel engine. It was a high-pitched, rhythmic clicking, a metallic tick, 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 that seemed to be coming from deep within the hull. It wasn't the usual groaning and creaking of an old boat. This was different. It was consistent. It was wrong. I put my hand against the steel bulkhead, feeling for a vibration. And there it was, a faint but definite shudder that matched the sound perfectly. I listened for a few more minutes, timing it. It was getting slightly faster. I walked over to one of the other deckhands, a young guy named Marco. "You hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He just shrugged. "Hear what? The engine?" "No," I said. "Something else, a clicking sound." He listened for a second, then shook his head. "It's an old boat, man. She's always making noise." He went back to coiling a rope, dismissing me completely. But I couldn't let it go. That sound was like a line of bad code in a perfect program, a tiny error that signals a catastrophic failure is imminent. I knew I had to tell Silas, even though I knew what was coming. I found him in the wheelhouse, his knuckles white as he gripped the helm, his eyes straining to pierce the impenetrable fog. I explained what I heard, what I felt. He didn't even turn to look at me. He just stared out into the gray void. "I've been sailing these waters since before you were born, kid," he said, his voice low and full of gravel. "I know every groan this boat makes. You're hearing ghosts. Now get out of my wheelhouse and make yourself useful." He waved a dismissive hand, and that was it. I was a child, an idiot hearing things. But as I walked back onto the deck, the clicking was louder now, more insistent. And I had the chilling realization that I was the only person on a boat full of seasoned sailors who could hear the sound of our own destruction approaching. If you've ever felt this way, just leave it in the comments. We get it. The clicking didn't stop just because Silas told me to get out. In fact, it seemed to mock his authority, growing louder, more insistent. It was the sound of a countdown. I stood on the deck, the wet, heavy air pressing in on me, my hands shoved in my pockets to keep them from trembling. The other men were a blur of motion and nervous energy, their voices low and tight as they peered into the impenetrable grayness. They couldn't hear it. They were listening for the roar of a rogue wave or the telltale groan of shifting cargo, the dangers they knew. I was listening to the ticking of a time bomb they couldn't comprehend. The smell of salt was thick, almost suffocating, mixed with the acrid scent of diesel exhaust and something else, the metallic tang of imminent failure. Then came a sound that wasn't a click. It was a scream, a high, violent shriek of metal grinding against rock, a sound that vibrated through the steel deck and up my spine, rattling my teeth. The entire boat lurched sideways, throwing me hard against the rail. Men yelled, curses ripped through the fog. A stack of crab pots broke loose and slid across the deck with a deafening crash. And then, the worst sound of all, silence. The steady, comforting thrum of the diesel engine sputtered, coughed once, and died. The sudden absence of that noise was more terrifying than the crash itself. We were adrift, powerless. The only sounds left were the rhythmic, hungry slap of water against the hull and the horrifying scrape of our keel against the unseen reef below. Panic, cold and sharp, began to ripple through the crew. These were men forged in ice and storms, men who had faced down the worst the Bering Sea could throw at them. But this was different. This wasn't a fight. It was a slow, inevitable execution. The tide was a relentless conveyor belt, pulling us inch by inch toward a shoreline we couldn't see, but all knew was there, a jagged row of teeth waiting to tear our hull to pieces. Silas was barking orders, his voice strained, but it was just noise. There was nothing to do. We were snagged, held fast by whatever had just tried to rip the guts out of the sea wolf. And I knew exactly what had happened. The propeller, the clicking I'd heard was likely a bearing or a gear failing. causing the prop to spin erratically until it caught something. Now it was either shattered or hopelessly tangled, wedged against the very rock that was holding us prisoner. We weren't just stuck. Our only means of escape was the thing keeping us trapped. And in that moment of chilling clarity, I knew I was the only person on this boat who could do a single thing about it. Without a conscious thought, my body started moving. I turned and headed for my dive locker, my mind already running a systems check on my gear. That's when Silas's voice stopped me cold. It wasn't a yell, but it cut through the rising panic like a rusted blade. "Don't be a hero, you idiot." He wasn't looking at the rocks or the tide. He was looking straight at me, his face a mask of pure, undiluted contempt. The words were a public condemnation, loud enough for every man on deck to hear. "You'll get yourself killed and be no use to anyone." The other men froze. Their fear of the rocks was suddenly replaced by a different kind of spectacle. My public humiliation. Their eyes, wide with a mix of fear and morbid curiosity, were all on me. The shame was a physical force, a hot wave that washed over me, threatening to buckle my knees. He wasn't just warning me, he was passing judgment. He was confirming what they all believed. I was the outsider, the tech boy, a liability playing at being a seaman. For a long second, I almost believed him. My hands, which had been moving with such purpose, now felt clumsy and weak. Who was I to defy a man like Silas? Who was I to think I could save these seasoned sailors who saw me as less than nothing? The wind whipped a cold spray across my face, and I tasted the salt on my lips. I looked from Silas's sneering face to the faces of the crew, waiting for me to back down, to prove them right. Then I looked past them, into the fog, and I imagined the rocks. I could almost hear them, a low grinding sound, waiting patiently. The shame was a powerful current, trying to drag me down, but the fear of dying in this icy water, of being torn apart on those rocks while everyone stood by helpless, was stronger. This wasn't about being a hero. This was about a system failure. It was a problem, and I was the only one with the tools to fix it. I didn't say a word. I just turned my back on him, on all of them, and walked to my locker. Every footstep felt impossibly heavy on the steel deck. I could feel their eyes boring into my back. The silence was absolute now, except for the groaning of the hull. My hands were trembling, not just from the cold, but from a terrifying mix of adrenaline and the raw fear of being so utterly publicly wrong. What if I got down there and it was something I couldn't fix? What if Silas was right, and I just got myself killed for nothing? The thought was a block of ice in my stomach. But the alternative was to do nothing, and that was a fate I couldn't accept. I pulled on my wetsuit, the cold, damp neoprene clinging to my skin. The clicks of the weight belt and tank buckles sounded like gunshots in the silence. I spat in my mask, the old diver's ritual feeling both absurd and deeply necessary. I grabbed my knife, its serrated edge a cold, hard promise. As I walked to the rail, I didn't look at anyone. I just focused on the gray, churning water below. It looked like a liquid tomb, but it was also the only way out. That's when everything changed, and no one ever looked at me the same way after that. Would you have done the same? Seriously, just answer with yes or no, so I know you're here. The moment I rolled backward over the rail and plunged into the sea, the world of fog and judgment vanished. The shock of the 40-degree water was a violent physical blow, a brutal hammer that drove the air from my lungs and every one of Silas's insults from my head. Down here there was no crew, no captain, no sneering faces. There was only the crushing pressure, the bone-deep cold, and a cathedral of green silence. The chaos on the surface was a distant, muffled memory. The only sound was the thumping of my own heart in my ears and the slow, rhythmic rasp of my regulator. The hull of the Seawolf loomed above me, a wounded, helpless whale, its massive shadow blocking out what little light pierced the murky depths. My light cut a cone through the green gloom, illuminating a blizzard of suspended particles. I followed the curve of the hull back toward the stern, my fins propelling me through the frigid water. And then I saw it. It was worse than I could have imagined. The propeller wasn't just tangled, it was entombed. A grotesque, greasy knot of discarded commercial fishing net, the kind that's thick as a man's thumb, had wrapped itself around the shaft and blades like a python. It was interwoven with thick strands of bull kelp and, glinting in my light, the rusted, jagged edges of what looked like an old crab pot. All of it cinched tight and wedged hard against the dark, barnacle-encrusted rock that held us captive. The boat's own power in its final moments had become its own prison, tightening the knot with every last rotation. My knife felt like a toy in my gloved hand. The cold was already starting to work its way into my bones, a deep, invasive ache that made my joints feel stiff and old. I went to work. The first cut was a lesson in futility. The net was so thick and dense, my serrated blade barely bit into it. I had to saw, putting my whole body into each stroke, my muscles already screaming in protest against the cold and the water's resistance. My fingers, even inside the thick neoprene gloves, were quickly becoming useless clubs of numb flesh. Every time my arm burned with effort, I heard Silas's voice echoing in the watery silence. "Don't be a hero, you idiot." Every time my lungs ached for more air than the regulator could provide, I saw the crew's eyes, judging me, waiting for me to fail. "You'll get yourself killed and be no use to anyone." A cold, quiet rage began to build inside me, a clean, pure fuel that fought back against the encroaching numbness. I wasn't just cutting a net anymore. I was cutting away their doubt. I was sawing through their contempt. With every ragged slice, I was severing the 1,000 little humiliations I'd endured. The sloppy bowline, the condescending laughter, the heavy, dismissive silence in the galley. It all fueled me. The current was a persistent, invisible hand, trying to shove me against the same rocks that held the boat, but I braced myself against the hull and kept cutting. Time ceased to exist. There was only the burn in my muscles, the rasp of my breath, and the slow, agonizing progress of the blade. One strand parted, then another. I hacked at the kelp, tore at the wire with my hands until they bled inside my gloves. Finally, I was down to the last, thickest section of rope, the heart of the knot. My air was running low. My vision was starting to tunnel. I knew I only had one more good effort in me. I wedged the knife in, and instead of trying to saw, I put both hands on the handle and used the last of my strength to heave, using the rock as leverage. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, tearing groan that I felt through the water, the mast tore loose. The propeller shaft was free. The whole tangled mess drifted away into the gloom like a dead sea creature. I broke the surface, gasping, ripping the regulator from my mouth. The fog was still thick, but the first thing I heard wasn't the slapping of waves. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my life, the deep, throaty, life-affirming roar of the Seawolf's diesel engine. The boat was already moving, its stern pulling away from me as it churned awake in the gray water. I was alone. Then, hands. Strong, calloused hands reached down and hauled me over the rail like a landed fish. I collapsed onto the steel deck, shivering uncontrollably, my muscles screaming, my gear feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I couldn't even stand. I just lay there, my cheek pressed against the cold, wet metal. And I listened. No one spoke. The usual deck chatter, the nervous jokes, the cursing, all of it was gone. The only sounds were the engine and the water rushing past the hull. I pushed myself up onto my elbows and looked. Marco, the young deckhand who had dismissed the clicking sound, was staring at me, his mouth slightly open. He looked down at his own clean hands, then back at me. Two of the older guys, men who had never once made eye contact with me, just stood frozen, their eyes wide. There was no mockery in their faces, no amusement. There was just a raw, naked astonishment. Then, the sound of heavy boots on the wet deck. Silas. He walked over from the wheelhouse and stood over me, his large frame blocking out the gray sky. I braced myself. For what, I wasn't sure. A final insult, and I told you so. He just stood there for a long moment. He didn't look at my face. His eyes were fixed on my hands, still clutching the knife, a few drops of blood mixing with the seawater on the blade. He cleared his throat, a low, gravelly sound. "Get him a blanket," he said, his voice a low rumble, not directed at me, but at the silent crew. "And some coffee." He turned and walked back to the wheelhouse without another word. He never said thank you. He never said I was right. He never apologized. He didn't have to. The silence on the long, slow journey back to the harbor wasn't the old kind, the one that was heavy with my exclusion. It was a different element entirely. It was full of the things they couldn't say. It was full of respect. They just knew. If you've ever proven something to someone in silence, comment, "They understood too late." The journey back to Kodiak Harbor was the longest and quietest of my life. The engine, which had been the sound of my impending death just an hour before, was now a steady, reassuring heartbeat beneath my feet. I sat on a bait box, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket that smelled of diesel and salt, a steaming mug of coffee warming my numb hands. No one spoke to me, but for the first time, the silence wasn't a weapon used to exclude me. It was something else. It was heavy, but with thought, not contempt. I'd catch the crew glancing at me when they thought I wasn't looking. Marco, the kid who'd told me I was hearing things, couldn't meet my eyes at all. He just kept himself busy on the far side of the deck, coiling and recoiling the same length of perfect rope. The other men, the old salts who had treated me like a ghost, now gave me a wide berth, as if I were something fragile, or perhaps dangerous. They moved around me with a new kind of caution. I wasn't the clumsy tech boy anymore. I was the man who had gone into the dark and come back. When we docked, the routine was the same as always, but my place in it had fundamentally shifted. Usually, I was the last one to get a task, handed the dirtiest job no one else wanted. This time, as the thick mooring lines were thrown to the dock, one of the older deckhands, a man named Gunner, who had a face like a weathered map of the islands, simply looked at me and nodded toward the bowline. He didn't say a word. I walked over, my muscles still aching with a deep, profound exhaustion, and tied the knot. My hands didn't shake. The rope felt like an extension of my own arm. It was a perfect bowline, tight and clean. Gunner checked it, gave a single curt nod, and walked away. That nod was more powerful than any apology. It was an acknowledgement, a transfer of trust. In the world of these men, where words were sparse and action was everything, that simple gesture was a formal acceptance into the tribe. Silas was the last one off the boat. He oversaw the securing of the vessel, his presence as large and unyielding as ever. I expected him to walk right past me, to maintain the wall of silence between us. But he stopped. He stood in front of me, close enough that I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. He was still looking at my hands. They were raw, torn up from the net and the rusted wire of the crab pot, the knuckles swollen and bruised. "You'll need to put something on those," he said, his voice a low gravel. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. An order, almost. Then he reached into his worn leather wallet, pulled out a folded $100 bill, and pushed it into the pocket of my jacket. "For the gear you lost," he said, referring to the knife I'd had to leave wedged in the rock to get the final leverage. He knew damn well that knife didn't cost $100. It wasn't a payment, it was a peace offering. It was his version of thank you. It was the only one I would ever get, and it was more than enough. In the weeks that followed, the change was less about big moments and more about 1,000 tiny shifts. The jokes about my background stopped. When I spoke, men listened. In the galley, they would leave a space for me at the table, and the conversation wouldn't die when I sat down. They started asking me questions, not about code or computers, but about currents, about visibility, about what the water felt like that day. They were asking me to speak the language of the sea, and for the first time, they believed I was fluent. The greatest change came from Silas. One morning, as we were heading out into another thick bank of fog, he called me up to the wheelhouse. He didn't say anything, just pointed to a strange reading on the sonar. "What do you make of that?" he asked. I looked at the screen, then out at the water, and gave him my best guess. He just grunted. But he didn't tell me to get out. He let me stay. We stood there for almost an hour, two quiet men staring into the gray, sharing a silence that was no longer empty, but full of a shared, unspoken understanding. The sea doesn't care who your father was. It doesn't care how many winters you've survived or how calloused your hands are. It's the ultimate meritocracy. Out there, in the cold and the gray, you are nothing more than the sum of what you can do when things go wrong. All the bravado, all the tough talk, all the stories of past storms, they all became meaningless when that engine died. In that moment of truth, the loudest voices on the boat fell silent, paralyzed by a problem they couldn't punch and a fear they couldn't navigate. It taught me the most profound lesson of my life. Respect isn't given, and it can't be demanded. It is forged in the crucible of a crisis. It's earned in the quiet moments when everyone else is shouting and you are the only one moving. It's proven not by what you say, but by what you are willing to go into the dark to fix. I came to Alaska thinking I needed to become like them to be accepted, but I learned I just needed to be myself, the quiet man who listened to the machine, the problem solver. My strength wasn't in my arms, but in my ability to hear the one sound everyone else was trained to ignore. They never called me a hero. The word never passed their lips. They just started calling me Diver. And on the Seawolf, that title meant more than any medal. But even now, late at night when the wind howls and the boat groans, a question still surfaces from the deep. I wonder if they ever truly see me, Alex, the man who was once a programmer. Or do they only see the function I served? It makes me question the very nature of the respect I earned. Do they remember me for what I did? Or do they just respect me now because in their moment of absolute terror, they needed me? If you've made it this far, you understand what it's like to be underestimated. Read this ending and comment with the one word that describes you when people doubted you.